This is Suchitra Vijayan, and before I start, I just want to thank everybody who is joining us today. Before I start off, I really want to go through a bunch of housekeeping, so that this conversation and this press conference becomes an easy way for us to deconstruct the report and get as much information out. For all of you logging in, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, you can send in your questions, and your questions will be moderated on the side. Again, if you have any questions, just write to or tweet at the Polis Project's platforms. The way we have structured the press conference today is that I would make a very quick introduction about what the report is and quickly introduce our panelists, and then both of them will make introductory remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Again, I just want to thank everybody who has been here. So we are on the eve of the 73rd year of India's independence, and on the eve of this moment, what we are seeing is a effort to arrest dissenting voices, whether they are students, rights activists, or others. Before I go into the report, I quickly want to tell you about the methodology of how this report came about. This report was created by a coalition of writers, scholars, authors around the world, and put together from ground reports. And Polis Project is absolutely thrilled and happy not happy, but actually we are saddened, but also we are actually very proud of publishing this as an act of moral courage and clarity. And I speak of the methodology, and the methodology is very important. And the methodology is not just about documenting and reporting, but the methodology is also about the fact that those who came together to author this report, their names are not in it, which means that the very act of putting your name down on a report is now become an act of not just sedition, but also fear that something might happen to these people, and also that we really need to protect these voices. While many of their names do not appear in this report, we are absolutely. It became an act of collective thinking. Many of them came together to do this report. Another thing about the report that I want to flag is that while it was written by a global coalition, the answers came from those on the ground. And it's really important for us to continue to amplify these and speak for them and about what is happening on the ground. The second thing that I really want to go in about the report is that this report is called Manufacturing Evidence, which means that it looks very directly at what is happening in the ground, especially what the police is doing, how the police has aided and abetted a series of violence that happened on the 23rd of February in India. And this violence was in response to a people's protest, an organic people's protest that started in India in response to the CAA and the NRC together, which have been called as the Nuremberg Laws. And in response to it, I think what the report really does is that it goes around and makes a very strong and a formidable case for how the police have not only abdicated their responsibility to protect, but they've also gone on to help the rioters and others to orchestrate this pogrom. But the most important thing that the report does, and does really well, is that it starts and it documents how working class Muslim communities that were also target of the violence are also being now coerced to create false testimonies, which will then go on to indict and also use to arrest and harass other human rights thinkers, writers, scholars. And at this moment, I'm going to go ahead and quickly introduce our panelists, but also for us to remember that Harsh Mandar, who is a human rights activist and peace worker and writer, Nadine Khan, who's a co-founder of the United Against Hate, and Dr. Apurva Anand, who teaches Hindi at Delhi University, all are currently being both called in for questioning and targeted. And it is really important for us to not only stand in solidarity with them, but also speak up. It's my pleasure to introduce author Arundhati Roy, who again has spoken with immense courage and moral and political clarity over many decades. And I'm really happy that she's here to talk about what's happening in India. I'm also joined by civil rights activist, author, and adjunct professor of law, Arjun Sethi, who is going to be giving us his response to the report. I would open it up to both Arundhati Roy and Arjun Sethi, and it will start with Arundhati Roy.
Thanks, Suchitra, and congratulations on this report. Of course, this tradition of what I call khaki fiction or the literary genre of police fiction isn't new in this country. And just as you have mentioned in this report, so many of the FIRs, so many of the affidavits or the confessions extracted in police custody are worded identically. This is also an old tradition in this country. But what is happening now is there is a radical rupture with the past, and of course the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the National Register, coupled with the National Register of Citizenship, does have echoes of the Nuremberg laws, because this is a new set of citizenship laws where the state requires citizens to produce a set of documents approved by the state in order to be given citizenship. So you can imagine in a country like India, where obviously it is directed against the Muslim community, but you have vast sections of the population of Dalits, of Adivasis, and other poorer people, as well as middle class people who do not have these documents, and therefore everybody somehow uh, criminalized in some way. You're tossed onto this ocean of uncertainty, a network of detention centers, and so on. And it is against this backdrop that this huge protest arose, a spontaneous protest started by students, taken over by women. Uh, the horror and the violence that we saw in Delhi first began in Uttar Pradesh, and in Delhi, of course, it ended with what was, I think, intended to be a pogrom, but eventually stopped short of a much larger tragedy, because the warnings and the threats had created awareness that such violence was being planned. So people were in some ways obviously prepared for it. What we have today and what we are up against today is why I say that there's a rupture from the past is that in the past we have obviously had illegal arrests, we've had communal conflagrations, we have had mass murder, we have genocidal killing against Sikhs in Delhi. But here it is all ideologically driven, and now that ideology, Hindutva ideology, which one is not speaking loosely when we say it is inspired by the Nazis. The ideologues have openly made similarities between the Jews of Germany and the Muslims of India and so on. But that hateful ideology today has become public policy. It has become something that you implement on the streets. It has become something that has taken over every institution that is essential for a country to call itself a democracy, and it has taken over the street. So, mob justice, mob attacks, all of that is now somehow protected at the very highest level. And we have a political party that, though it functions in what used to be a democracy, where political parties fought in all sorts of ugly ways to win elections, but none of them ever thought that an opposition was unnecessary. But now the opposition has been annihilated. The election machinery is completely compromised or taken over. And no other form of dissent, whether it's students, whether it's activists, whether it's lawyers, whether it's writers, no dissent is acceptable now. It's like every pinhole of light is being blocked. If you're in a prison cell, your window is going to be boarded up. And so, of course, now that students, lawyers, activists, the brains of this country are moving into prisons, and the universities are being rid of anyone with a mind of their own. So we are in a totalitarian situation now where everybody, every day, somebody's being picked up, somebody's being shut down, somebody's being threatened, somebody's being warned. And every single one of those threats, every single one of those extracted custodial confessions where someone else is implicated then terrifies a whole lot of people and silences a whole lot of people. So yeah, that is roughly the situation.
Arjun, would you like to make your opening statements?
Sure. Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you, Arundhati. I want to start by really thanking the activists, community leaders, rights defenders, and journalists on the ground who made this report possible. As Arundhati pointed out, folks who speak out in India today risk doxing, character assassination, professional reprisal, arrest, violence, and death. And so the very act of putting out this report, the very act of speaking out is the most basic and vital form of resistance. And we need to continue to amplify the work that they are doing every day under the most extenuating of circumstances. Stepping back, sort of giving a kind of broad perspective, just in roughly the last year or so, we saw the revocation of the autonomy of Kashmir. We saw the perpetration of additional human rights atrocities there. Rising hate violence in India, hate violence that is so common that it's often organized on WhatsApp groups and then carried out in videos uploaded online. We saw the NRC and CAA. But in response, we also saw a widespread populist movement, one that perhaps India hasn't seen for generations. It was led by young people and women. And it was a movement that also picked on globally. When Modi visited the United States, there were protests here, there were protests worldwide. And the response of the government and organized Hindutva elements really has been twofold. One, a campaign of misinformation, fake news, chilling of dissent, crushing of protest, and violence. And so we saw in February 2020 in Delhi what can, in no other words, but be described as a pogrom that targeted Muslims, in which 3/4 of those who died were in fact Muslims. And this is why this report is so important. And so with that, I want to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about some of the findings of the report, and how it can help kind of light a way forward in terms of some of the activism that we should be thinking about. Among other things, the report finds that the Delhi police were absolutely complicit and at times enabled the February violence, that they failed to help survivors at the time, that they continue to refuse to hold the Hindutva nationalist perpetrators accountable, including senior BJP officials. And today, right now, the Delhi police are in the process of basically hatching a conspiracy theory where they are blaming innocent protesters and Muslim activists for the very violence that targeted their community. Specifically on the first point regarding the role of Delhi police and how they were complicit and enabled the violence. The report does a very good job of making clear how there were numerous instances where police actually threatened protesters. At times, they even engaged in physical attacks. They reminded us of the viral video of the story when police actually surrounded 5 Muslim men who were on the ground and forced to actually sing the national anthem. And the report draws a really interesting analogy. And they said, look at George Floyd in the United States, right? The officer who killed George Floyd was charged within 4 days. None of the police who committed the atrocity that day against those Muslim men have been charged. And one of those Muslim men has died from his injuries. The report also talks about how petrol bombs and other weapons were made in front of the police, and they did nothing. The report also talks about how Delhi police failed to support survivors at the time. They talk about how there were more than 13,000 distress calls, many of which simply were ignored or went unanswered. In one particular case, they actually quote a deposition that says, quote, "We called the police many times, but they never returned the calls or simply humiliated us on the phone and said they cannot help. In other cases, they failed to help the injured get medical treatment. So this is clear impunity. This is clear complicity. And in some cases, even participation and incitement of violence that led to the pogrom that targeted Muslims in February 2020. The report also finds that the police continue today to refuse to entertain, accept, acknowledge, and really affirm the grievances and complaints made by Muslims since the atrocity occurred. And so they give examples of how, in some cases, Muslims have actually filed complaints, but the police won't turn them into FIRs, which is the process for actually properly commencing an investigation in India. Or when they do, they give anonymity to the perpetrators because they want to continue to enable impunity, especially in the case where Muslims have alleged atrocities by BJP leaders. And so, again, parallel to the United States, many have simply lost faith, right? And many simply don't believe that the police are there to help them in any form or shape. And so their quest for justice continues. And then finally, the report also lays out really in extraordinary detail something that you described, Suchitra, and really the name of the report, Manufacturing Evidence, namely that Delhi police are presently rounding up Muslims, in particular young Muslim boys and men, putting them under extraordinary pressure, coercive pressure, duress, and extracting false evidence, testimony, and confessions from them about crimes they didn't commit, and in some cases worse, forcing them to implicate elders and folks who just protested, expressed their right to protest peacefully against these fascist laws that really are modeled after Nazi Germany. And that's what's happening on the ground today. And so they talk about how the charge sheets, in some cases, quote, specifically say things like, the riots were part of a well-designed conspiracy drafted during CAA NRC protests. Think about how absurd this is, right? 3/4 of those who perished were Muslims. And now they're claiming that the Muslims themselves in this diabolical conspiracy planned this atrocity against their community, and at the same time claiming that people, these, in some cases, young people and women who were engaged in peaceful protests, created this the circumstances to basically create this pogrom. And they are also, Delhi police, in doing so, simultaneously ignoring and hiding evidence of the role played by Hindu nationalist, in some cases, mobs. There are WhatsApp groups that have been discovered that specifically show coordinated acts targeting Muslims during the days in question. They're also ignoring speeches and messages of incitement delivered by BJP officials publicly and on airwaves. Those statements are nowhere to be found. And so with that, in terms of where we go from here, the report makes numerous recommendations, and I would just like to echo those and really add to them too. First, that all human rights activists, defenders be released immediately. 2, that those responsible for the atrocities be arrested and prosecuted. 3, that the United States Congress, State Department, reach out formally in written correspondence to the Indian government, expressing concern about the latest evidence played by the role of Delhi police in the atrocity, and demanding a full accounting of what happened during the pogrom of February 2020, and asking for a repeal of CAA and NRC, which on their face are Islamophobic, fascist, and can be described as nothing other than authoritarian. We also need an independent body. That's been an ask, an independent, impartial body. That's been an ask by observers on the ground, activists on the ground, by the UN, to document and account for what happened. We need philanthropists to step up, right? For a long time, the broader philanthropic community has given India a pass and called India the world's largest democracy. As I sometimes like to say now, India has become the world's largest authoritarian empire. And so philanthropists need to support community organizations on the ground, like the folks who produced this report, manufacturing evidence, and support them. They need to support groups who are doing that work here in the United States. We need to mobilize folks in the United States and who are part of the diaspora as well. Last year, right, the Gates Foundation continued, despite international condemnation, to give Modi an award. Just last week, we saw organized Hindutva elements display a series of ads in Times Square celebrating the destruction of the Babri Masjid. And so folks in the US have to be engaged. And they also need to understand really the intersection between white supremacy and Hindutva supremacy, right? And this idea that we're trying to combat destructive forces in whatever context they appear. And the last point I will make is global fascism and authoritarianism aren't creeping. They are here. They have arrived and they are spreading. And so anybody who believes in the right to protest, who believes in the right to speech, who believes in democracy, a thriving civil society, should be deeply concerned about what is happening worldwide, and in particular about what is happening in India today.
Arjun, thank you for that. And we have a series of questions coming in. I will start.
I just want to say
Sure.
two things. That what is left out in this narrative, including in the report, is the role of the courts and the role of the media in India, and that continues today up to now. The media amplifying this story of the police, the media sort of bludgeoning everybody into a sort of silence, the courts refusing to take action even while the bloodletting was happening, and also the fact that alongside the killing and the burning and the destruction of businesses, there was the destruction of many mosques. In the videos, both in UP and Delhi, when you hear the invective muttered under the breaths of these policemen against Muslims, you understand that fascism isn't about Modi and the government now. It's out on the street. That indoctrination is complete and dangerous.
And we also saw the picking up and the torture of minors in UP soon after the violence broke out. The Quill Foundation and a series of organizations came together to produce reports. They were documentation of torture. And again, what we see is that news cycle is now gone. We're no longer talking about these young boys picked up.
And any Kashmiri watching this program will just smile and say, how long has it been going on with us? How many minors have been killed and tortured? 13,000 people were arrested this time last year, many of whom are still in prison under preventive detention for no crime at all. So it's the texture of our lives now. This.
And I'm going to start putting these questions to both of you. One of the questions, I'm combining some of these questions. One is from Sabina Basha, who says, "It's great to have this report. What are the probable next steps? The system in India is compromised." So there are a bunch of other questions that have kind of echoed the same questions. Is that, yes, we have this report. There's a documentation. We have proof. We have evidence. What next? What do we do next?
Well, I can't answer that question because I agree that there is a complete shutting down and there is a closing off of all the avenues that we would normally, walk on to try and get some form of justice. That people who were convicted for mass murder in the Gujarat pogrom of 2002 are acquitted and walking around free. You know, people who admitted to hacking people, raping people, burning children, they are free. So we are not a nation where it's more dangerous to murder one person than to commit mass murder in India, you know. And the chances of people getting justice, I would say, are limited. One of the politicians who was chanting that slogan, Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro salon ko, the next appearance he made was besides the finance minister when she was announcing, relief for COVID. And it was a signal. He was translating the relief measures in Hindi. And it was a signal to everybody that, look, this person is protected, and what he said on the streets is respected in government quarters. He was a minister, actually, a minister of state. So whether or not this leads to anything, we have to do this work, maybe for historical reasons. Someday these files will be opened and read, and I believe that for a different set of reasons that doesn't have to do exactly with this Delhi pogrom, I do believe that we have crossed some kind of Rubicon, where the propaganda may win them elections, the propaganda may take them to victory even in 2024, the destruction of the opposition. But internationally, the big plates are moving and changing, and this is not a regime who has destroyed an economy apart from everything else that can survive the winds of change that are blowing now. And we will be going through a period of great fear and darkness and destruction. But I think the demise of this regime is rolled into the peak of their power right now. So we must do the reports. We must keep the. We must do it for history, if not for now.
Arjun, would you like to respond, or should we go on to the next question?
Just really quickly, I think archiving this moment is very important. I think learning from folks on the ground, so getting a sense from Arundhati and from the authors of the report about what we can do to support their work is important. I also do feel that for way too long, India has hidden under the guise of world's largest democracy. And I think a lot of allies and activists internationally and folks on the ground in India have done an extraordinary job in really kind of removing that veneer. And so I think we just need to continue to talk about what's happening there. We need to talk about how civil society is being crushed, how courts are complicit. And yeah, right, let's not give, if Biden is elected, let's not give the Biden administration a pass, right? I mean, it was ultimately Obama in so many ways who welcomed Modi into the international order, right? He was banned from entering the United States, right? There needs to be additional conversation about why this man was allowed to re-enter the United States. And, the last point I want to make is I also think that we also need to be building better bridges with folks who are kind of in the technology activist community. And so, for example, India leads the world in internet blackouts. India has also created one of the world's most sophisticated fake news, disinformation empires, right? Anytime you speak about things, you get trolled, you get doxxed. I'm sure that they'll come for us shortly after this conversation. And so we need to do a better job of actually understanding the forces of technology and even surveillance that enable authoritarianism in India as well.
And the additional small point, since I know that some foreign correspondents who live in India may be watching this show, and they cannot, of course, ever say this themselves, but all of them are disciplined by a visa regime where their visas will be revoked if they are found to be reporting negatively. So there's a great balancing act that's going on in terms of worrying about getting kicked out of the country. It's not just foreign correspondents, but anybody, any of you who come and go will find it increasingly difficult if you speak the truth. So yeah, we are living in a time when to be murdered is a crime. Your ghost will be called to the police station and interrogated and tortured and perhaps made to confess.
And the second set of questions and themes that are emerging from the questions that we're getting is the rule of law and misrule by men. We have a direct question to Arundhati Roy that says, what do you make of the recent judgment against Prashant Bhushan? And we have a bunch of other questions that kind of hit on the same things about the role of courts in legitimizing the current regime.
Well, I myself have had a run in with the courts on contempt. I was held guilty of contempt and jailed in 2002. So I have actually written quite a lot about why that law ought not to exist. The law of scandalizing and lowering the dignity of the courts. And I would say that um, even in the matter of the Delhi pogrom, you had a situation where the BJP politicians who were chanting these very, very provocative slogans, urging people to kill traitors. Traitors equals Muslims equals Pakistanis. And Goli Maro Salon ko. Actually, there was a time when a man did appear with a gun at the Jamia Millia protests and so on. And the courts were asked to intervene, but they didn't. And one of the judges who was going to intervene was transferred from the Delhi High Court at night. So there is the danger now is that every institution that could check this power is either completely compromised or the people running it are compromised. So there is this great sense that we are in free fall. There's no place on the cliff to hold on or to prevent the collapse. And it is that sense is increased by the economic collapse that has come with the COVID lockdown. The sense has increased with the fact that the protests, the anti-CA, NRC protests were shut down by COVID actually, and so people are feeling alone and isolated. And while we were locked down, the arrests were happening, the confessions were being extracted, people were being rounded up in Northeast Delhi, young men just dragged to prison, sometimes being told, come to collect your compensation, and then being arrested there, you know. So it's the killing and the pogrom is just the foundational layer. On top of it, the levels of wickedness that go on in an area like that. If you go to that place and see it, it's like a colony. I mean, a huge settlement of human beings that live on a network of drains with garbage 1 meter thick floating on it. And everyone lives. A lot of the people in places like Shivvihar, they live in these little one-room homes, and I've visited them, and the fear of being locked in there when there's armed mobs outside chanting for your death. Their businesses have been burnt down, uh, and COVID on top of it. How are people supposed to even survive? So it's a situation where there's no help anywhere, except from people like activists and lawyers, and even they are now being taken in.
The other set of themes that are coming in are about something that Arjun flagged early on, the relationship between the diaspora, Hindutva, and white supremacy. And we have a question from Mehermanda who says, diaspora Hindutva supporters use money for propaganda. Read the Times Square incident. How do we counter that? Arjun?
I mean, I think first and foremost through education, in the same way that we tell Facebook, you shouldn't be lifting up white supremacist outfits, in the same way that we tell Square and PayPal, you shouldn't be enabling financial transactions between neo-Nazis. We should also be telling folks, just like we did in Times Square, you shouldn't be uplifting supremacist ideologies that have enabled the atrocities that we're discussing today. I also think it's just important for there to be education at the state level, at the county level, at the national level. I want to lift up, I believe there are 6 US cities that have passed resolutions condemning CAA and NRC. Folks in India love to discredit it, love to say it doesn't matter. It does matter. And it shows that more and more people every day in this country, junior elected leaders, senior elected leaders, the state level, at the federal level, are continuing to learn. And so I think a lot of it is just political mobilization, it's education. In some cases, let's just be real, right? It's also conversations with our elders, right? I mean, there are folks in our community who can't stand Donald Trump, but they support Narendra Modi, right? When they are two sides of the same coin. And specifically in regards to money, you know, in some cases, like I've said before, we need to be supporting community organizations in this country who are doing this work. And for a long time, the philanthropic community has turned a back on activists doing work in India because they said there are bigger fish to fry, or we don't have to worry about India. And that's why the perpetrators of the genocide against Sikhs in '84 and in Delhi have never been held accountable. That's why the folks who engage in the atrocities in Gujarat have never been held accountable and still roam freely. And that's why we fear that those who perpetrated the pogrom of February are going to roam free.
We have other questions coming in as well. I'm going to put another question to Arundhati Roy. With George Floyd protests, we saw the Black community, especially the Black and Brown community in the United States, mobilize and take the street in the middle of a COVID pandemic. We have a series of questions that come in that's saying that what more would have to happen in India for us to have a mobilization? Can we reanimate and recreate another Shine Bagh in the middle of a COVID?
So the whole enterprise that is happening now, reversing the narrative of what happened in Northeast Delhi, is in preparation for the fear that there will be at some time an outburst. So they want to take in the leaders, the organizers, the activists, the thinkers, and leave that movement bereft of the guiding forces that really made it into what it was. But, you know, I think that, as I said, you know, the situation is so complicated right now because you have the celebration of the anniversary of the abrogation of Section 370 in Kashmir, and the inauguration and the laying of the foundation stone of the Ram Mandir, you know, planned for the same day, at a time when the triumphalism around Kashmir has certainly lost its edge, because not only has Kashmir refused to lie down and die, you have that the belligerence and the boasting of the Home Minister and Defense Minister saying we're going to take the Pakistan part of Kashmir, we're going to take Aksai Chin, has created a kind of earthquake on the borders, you know. So you have a scenario where this economy that is supposed to shrink by between 3 and 13% now has to deploy a massive battle-ready army, even on the Eastern Front, ready for high-altitude warfare, where they don't even have the warm clothes, let alone the weapons or anything, you know. So we are in a situation where the propaganda machine that has been designed entirely to win elections is up against a reality that whether there's propaganda or not, it's that moment where the rubber meets the road, you know. And I think uh, whatever happens, whether there's a protest or whether there isn't a protest, we are in a situation where there's going to be some kind of a meltdown, you know, and the idea of putting people into detention centers and foreigners tribunals and all that seems sort of so pre-COVID. Now you're really in a situation where this enormous country has, I mean, demonetization shot down the engine of the economy. The GST and COVID has come and taken off the tires of the vehicle. So it's it's a crisis on so many fronts, that this kind of stupidity, because fascism, the integral part of fascism is also stupidity. Stupidity cannot deal with the level of crisis that we are facing now: unemployment, hunger, environmental stuff, military confrontation. I mean, while the election machinery has been oiled and is functioning smoothly, a new world order has made itself known, and India has linked itself to the powers of yesterday, which is the United States. And is saying that, oh, they'll come and save us. I said, really? Like they saved the Kurds in Syria, or like they saved the Afghans, or like they saved the Iraqis, or like they saved the South Vietnamese. So there's an international shift that's going on, which is going. I mean, so I don't know whether we need to do anything. That momentum is already rushing in.
We are already at the 40-minute mark, so I'm going to combine two questions that I think might also lead as concluding remarks. This question actually comes from me, and I'm going to combine a question from somebody else who also says, "Is there a way for us to think about things differently?" Idea of doing things differently. Um, is this a moment, Arundhati Roy? I know that you spoke about pandemic as a portal, this moment to rethink. Do you think this is actually a moment for us to radically rethink the way we rule, govern, live ourselves? If so, how can this radical rethinking also translate into building new communities, building new systems? I was wondering if you can talk about that. Both you and Arjun can talk about this idea of, is it possible now to radically reimagine things differently? If so, how would we do it?
Well, obviously, whether we want to or not, we will have to. There's no way that you can pretend that there hasn't been a rupture, that the huge machinery of capitalism hasn't sort of ground to some kind of a halt. And while certain individuals are making a lot of money, the fact is that the world cannot go on the way it is. And it's been obvious that countries which have been hyper capitalist, like the United States, like India, is trying to be countries which have literally nothing like healthcare, have just, I mean, the three geniuses of the early 21st century, Trump and Modi and Bolsonaro, are numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the COVID idiocy battle. So things do have to change, but how will they change? They will not change because everyone just decided to be a better human being, or every country suddenly had a new moral rule book. The change will come only from destruction, you know. So we are going to face a period of great unrest, of great pain. I don't know how many of us, I don't know, like how long someone like me uh, is going to be, out, out, able to speak and so on. But at some point, I do believe that this is the beginning of the end of this regime and this kind of way of thinking. But that doesn't mean that we'll all step through the portal beautifully. I think it'll come with a lot of pain, with a lot of destruction, with perhaps war and even a kind of civil war. Things are going to break down very badly. And then maybe some new sense will prevail on the human race.
Arjun?
It's not often that I mention Adorno, and I know Suchitra, you've read Adorno, and we've spoken about Adorno. I mean, he's written a lot, in his life about, destruction and intellectual ruins, and the power of imagination. And I'm remembering, reflections from a damaged life, minima moralia. I think about last year, and I think about the widespread protests we saw in so many different countries across the world. It felt like every week I would wake up and there was mass mobilization happening. And then you saw COVID, and COVID was a natural suppressant in that way. But I think the people of the world were onto something. Whether it was taking on sort of hyper excess capitalism in one of its manifestations, which is, of course, gross inequality, whether it's environmental catastrophe, rising sea levels. We know that sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is most impacted by climate change, and in some cases, many indigenous communities across the world. And now you think of COVID. You think of structural racism, and you think, for example, in the United States, in terms of who's most impacted, folks who are on the front lines, who are in essential jobs, which are often people of color, who is also less likely to have health care. Again, in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, folks of color. And then you just think about some of the stimulus plans that have been rolled out, and small businesses still aren't getting the support and resources they need. And that's happening really across the world. And so whether you think about things politically, whether you think about things economically, in terms of social policy like healthcare, or really, right, arguably like the greatest human rights catastrophe we've ever seen, which is the destruction of our home, climate. I think now is a time to imagine. And if we don't take care to reimagine and build a more just and equitable world, we've seen what that world will look like. And it's what we're witnessing right now. It's a world that is rampant with disease, hunger, corruption, exploitation, abuse, and the like.
Arjun Sethi and Arundhati Roy, thank you so much for joining us. I just have a couple of messages, a couple of information to go out. There is, on the question of community building, taking the streets, there is a vigil that is being organized in New York. If you follow our social media handles, you can be a part of it. We hope that these vigils also become a way for us to build community around that. Second, I know I said this in the beginning of the conversation, and I want to conclude with that, is that bigotry is big business. And to counter it some ways, what we need is a pedagogy that is political. In that moment, I want to talk about those who came together to write this report from the ground. And also, while we are proud to publish this report, it's also great sadness that those who authored this report cannot put their names on it. The report carries no names, and I think just as we speak up, it's also important for us to recognize the silences. At Polis Project, we are available to answer more questions. Again, I really hope the journalists who came in today for not only asking the questions, but I hope you would amplify this report, but more importantly, speak up and write and do the work you're supposed to do. Again, Arundhati Roy, Arjun Sethi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.